ready for a deep dive into some fascinating Hindu philosophy. Today we're tackling Ananda bliss and its place in our very existence. You've sent over selections from Guruvo Sarancham, specifically focusing on the Anandamaya Kosha, the blissful sheath.
Exactly. And we'll be pulling apart not just what this sheath represents, but how different scholars interpret its meaning and significance, especially since it's such a rich concept.
Okay, so before we get to the blissful part, can you give us a quick rundown on what these sheaths are in the first place?
Of course. In Hindi philosophy, the five kosher or sheaths are a way to understand the layers of human existence. Think of it like an onion, where each layer gets you closer to the core. Each sheath is dominated by a certain aspect.
I like that analogy, peeling back the layers. So what's the first layer we're dealing with?
The first is the ānandamaya kosha, the sheath of food. This is the most physical layer, your tangible body, what you eat, your physical experience in the world.
Right, that makes sense. The most outwardly obvious part of us. What about the next layer?
Next is the prasamaya kosha, dominated by our life force, the energy that keeps us going. You can think of it as your breath, your pulse, the very essence that keeps your physical body animated.
It's like the difference between a body and a living, breathing person. Then we have the mind, right?
Exactly. That's the Manomaya Kosha, where our thoughts and emotions hang out, constantly chattering, reacting, and creating our inner world.
Those three sheaths feel relatable. Most of us navigate those aspects of ourselves daily. But I'm guessing the last two get a little more abstract.
You're right. The next two dive into subtler realms. The fourth is the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the sheath of wisdom. This isn't just about knowing facts. It's about deeper understanding, intuition, and that gut feeling that tells you what's really true.
Intriguing. And then we finally arrive at our star of the show, the Anandamaya Kosha, where bliss reigns supreme.
Precisely. It's considered the most subtle because unlike the previous four, which are easier to grasp conceptually, this one requires a shift in how we perceive ourselves and the world.
Well, that's why we're here. You mentioned before that there are different scholarly interpretations of this bliss sheath. The materials you sent over highlighted Sri Aurobindo's view and how he distinguishes the bliss sheath from the wisdom sheath. What makes it so unique?
Aurobindo makes a fascinating distinction. He says it's not about a difference in the ānanda, the bliss itself, but a shift in consciousness. He compares it to experiencing the world from the peak of a mountain versus down in the valley.
Wow, that's a powerful image. So the bliss is the same, but our vantage point, our perspective changes completely, right?
Exactly. Imagine seeing the world spread out before you, no longer limited by the narrow view from the valley. Aurobindo also says ānanda on lower planes is diluted, but in this elevated state, it becomes dense light, a potent, undiluted experience.
That makes sense, like focusing a beam of light to increase its intensity. And the materials you sent over also mention the Taittiriya Upanishad and how it describes this sheath.
Yes, the Taittiriya Upanishad tells us the Anandamaya Kosha is fashioned out of bliss and actually fills the knowledge sheath. It even provides this incredibly vivid description. Love is the head, joy the right side, pleasure the left, bliss as its spirit, and the eternal as its very foundation.
That's beautiful imagery, very evocative. But it does beg the question, what does Ananda, this bliss, actually mean in this context? Is it just about feeling happy?
That's a crucial point and why understanding the Anandamaya Kosha is so important. Aurobindo emphasizes that this bliss isn't simply fleeting happiness or joy. He argues that it's the fundamental nature of our spirit, the source of its power, and its truest self.
So it's less about emotions and more like the very essence of our being.
Precisely. Śaṃkarācārya, another renowned scholar, beautifully defines it as the nature of absolute happiness.
Absolute happiness. That's a powerful concept and definitely something I want to explore further. But before we do, reading through the materials you sent over, something struck me as a bit of a contradiction. If Ananda is this transcendent, all-encompassing thing, why is it considered a kosha, a sheath at all? Shouldn't it be beyond these classifications?
That is an excellent question, and it gets right to the heart of why there's so much debate around the Anandamaya Kosha. It leads us to the question, whose bliss are we actually talking about?
Whose bliss? That really makes you think. It's almost as if the nature of bliss itself is being debated here, whether it's personal or universal.
You've hit the nail on the head. You see, the source material points to a debate among scholars about whether the Anandamaya Atman, the blissful soul mentioned in the Taittiriya Upanishad, refers to the Jivatma, the individual soul, or the Paramatma, the supreme soul. And as you alluded to earlier, the multifaceted nature of Sanskrit allows for these multiple interpretations.
So it's like asking, Are we talking about my personal experience of bliss or some kind of ultimate divine bliss that's the source of everything? No easy answers, I guess.
Not at all. There are actually three main interpretations that emerge. Some scholars connect it directly to our own individual soul, while others say it points towards the supreme soul, either in its accessible, immanent form or in its more transcendent, formless aspect.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Where do we even begin with these different viewpoints?
Let's start with Badarayana, a hugely influential scholar. In his Brahma Sutra, he seems to lean towards the supreme soul interpretation.
That's interesting. What's his reasoning there?
He pays close attention to the structure of the word Anandamaya. See, he interprets that suffix maya to mean abundance, not just modification. This subtle difference is key for him because it suggests that this isn't just exactly. But then we have another prominent perspective, this time from the unnamed commentator of the Śaṃkarācārya Mimaisavetti. He actually favors the individual soul interpretation.
Oh, wow. So a completely different take. What leads him to that conclusion?
Well, for him, the Anandamaya Kosha is still very much tied to the individual. He sees it as an extension of the previous four sheaths, still bound by the limitations of our physical and mental existence.
So unlike Badarayana, he doesn't see the bliss sheath as this entirely transcendent thing, completely separate from us.
Precisely. He interprets Maya as modification, implying that the bliss we experience here is still conditioned by who we are, where we are in our journey. It's a more personal experience.
So it's almost like two sides of the same coin. On one hand, this sheath points towards a divine, limitless bliss, but on the other, it's something we can access within ourselves, even with all our human limitations. How fascinating.
You've summarized it beautifully, and this tension, this dance between individual experience and something much larger is going to be a recurring theme as we go deeper.
This is getting really interesting. But I have to admit, it's a lot to take in two seemingly opposite viewpoints. So how do we reconcile them? Is there some middle ground here?
That's where śaṃkarācārya enters the stage. He's brilliant because he provides this nuanced perspective that doesn't just pick a side, it bridges the divide between Badarayana and the unnamed commentator.
I always appreciate a good synthesis. What's śaṃkarācārya's secret?
Well, in his Brahma Sutra commentary, he actually agrees with Badarayana, stating that the Anandamaya Kosha ultimately refers to the Parabrahman, the supreme divinity. He even backs this up with a bunch of scriptural quotes to make his case.
Okay, so he's on Team Supreme Bliss. But then how does he reconcile that with the unnamed commentator's view?
Here's the fascinating part. In his Paitiriyapanyan commentary, he actually agrees with the modification interpretation of Maya.
Hold on, that seems like a complete contradiction. How can he agree with both sides?
This is where śaṃkarācārya's brilliance really shines through. He's not contradicting himself. He's adding a whole new dimension. You see, he emphasizes that the five sheaths aren't separate compartments, but rather a continuum, a spectrum of spiritual consciousness.
So it's not an either-or situation. They're all connected, flowing into each other.
Exactly. And he has this amazing way of putting it. He says, Brahman is both the HCF and LCM of the sheaths.
The HCF and LCM. Sorry, I've lost me a little there.
Right, sorry about that. Sometimes I get a little too into the technical terms. Think of it like this. Brahman, that ultimate reality, is both the common thread running through all the sheaths, and D, it's the ultimate culmination, the fullest expression of that same consciousness.
Oh, that makes sense.
Huh?
So even though the sheaths are different, they're all ultimately expressions of that same underlying reality.
You've got it. And this actually links back to something we were talking about earlier, that as above, so below principle.
Right, like that idea that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm. Is that where śaṃkarācārya is going with this?
Precisely. He's aligning himself with the concept of pitcha praleka, which you can think of as the microcosmic hologram. It's this idea that each of us, in our own small way, mirrors the Brahmic praleka, the vast macrocosmic hologram of the universe. Each level, each sheath, reflects and contains the essence of the whole.
So basically, we each contain the universe within us, and the universe contains us. It's kind of mind-blowing when you put it like that.
It really is. And you know what's even more fascinating is that this isn't just some ancient philosophical idea. Modern science is starting to catch up with this whole idea of interconnectedness.
Oh, really? Do you have an example in mind?
Absolutely. There's a researcher, D. Bias, who developed this hollow informational model of transpersonal consciousness. He describes 5 levels of reality that, believe it or not, directly mirror the Pañika Kosha.
Wow, what are the odds? So he's essentially saying the same thing, just in a different language.
In a way, yes. He talks about how each of these levels, from the physical world we experience to the most subtle spiritual realms, are interconnected. And even more importantly, each level contains information about the whole. It's like each part of us, each sheath, holds the blueprint for the entire universe.
That's incredible. So it's not just an ancient philosophical idea. Modern science is finding evidence for it, too.
Exactly. It adds a whole other layer of validity to the idea that these sheaths aren't just random, isolated things. They're interwoven aspects of a much larger, unified reality.
So where does this leave us with śaṃkarācārya and his interpretation of the Anandamaya Kosha?
Well, remember how the Vugavali section of the Taittiriya actually declares each kosha, each sheath, as Brahman.
Yeah, it's like even the densest, most physical layer, the Anandamaya Kosha, is ultimately Brahman in some way.
That's it. And this brings us back full circle to Śaṃkarācārya's genius. He acknowledges that, yes, on an individual level, the Anandamaya Kosha can be seen as a conditioned state. It's still shaped by our human experiences, limitations, all that. But key, and this is the crucial part, it's also the gateway, the bridge to experiencing the Parabrahman directly. It's like taking a quantum leap in consciousness from our limited individual experience of bliss to realizing its true nature as this boundless, infinite source.
It's like this sheath is both a destination and a starting point. We experience glimpses of this bliss in our lives, but it's also pointing us towards something much greater.
You've got it. And this leads us to one of the most intriguing and, let's be honest, strange analogies in the Taittiriya. It says Brahma Pucha Praptiya, which translates to divinity is the tail that supports.
Divinity is the tail that supports. Okay, now that one really has me stumped. What's the deal with the tail?
It's definitely one of the more head-scratching metaphors, right? Of course, it's not meant to be taken literally. Śaṃkarācārya explains that the tail actually symbolizes the source, the foundation from which all worldly bliss arises.
So even those limited, conditioned experiences of happiness we have, they're ultimately rooted in something much deeper, that divine source.
Exactly. And if we take this analogy even further and apply it to the human body, it gets even more interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the connection to the human body?
Well, the Taittiriya is subtly pointing us towards our own tailbone, the coccyx.
Our tailbone. But that's like practically useless, just a leftover from our evolutionary past. What does that have to do with anything?
That's what's so striking about this analogy. Even though the tailbone seems insignificant, in Kundalini Yoga, it's associated with the Muladhara Chakra, the base energy center where Kundalini energy is said to lie dormant.
So this seemingly insignificant bone actually holds deep spiritual significance. I never would have guessed.
Exactly. And it adds a whole other dimension to how we understand the Anandamaya Kosha. It's both a conditioned state within us, shaped by our experiences, but also this gateway to tapping into that unconditioned bliss of the divine that resides within.
It's like how we often overlook the tailbone, but it's still there, pointing to this hidden potential within us, just like the bliss sheath. This is so cool.
I know, right? And that's the beauty of really diving deep into these concepts. It's not just about intellectual understanding. It's about recognizing that potential for experiencing this profound bliss within ourselves.
Absolutely. So we've explored the different interpretations, the idea of a continuum, the connection to our own bodies. Is there anything else we need to cover regarding this blissful sheath? So we've explored the different interpretations, the idea of a continuum, the connection to our own bodies. Is there anything else we need to cover regarding this blissful sheath?
You're right. There's always more to explore. We've been mainly focusing on how the Anandamaya Kosha is understood within a specific school of thought called Kevaladvaita Darshana, absolute non-dualism. But it's important to remember that other branches of Hindu philosophy have their own interpretations.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
It'd be like only getting one perspective on, say, quantum physics. There's a whole world of other interpretations out there. So are there any alternate views on the Anandamaya Kosha that we should touch on?
Definitely. For instance, there's Vishiddhaita Daishana, which is qualified non-dualism, a bit of a mouthful, I know. This school of thought, championed by Sri Aurobindo in his work, the Yurvaya, offers a different take on the blissful sheath.
Okay, so instead of absolute non-dualism, it's qualified non-dualism. Like there are some nuances, some distinctions being made.
Yeah.
How does that play out in their understanding of the Anandamaya Kosha?
In this view, the highest realm attainable by the individual soul, the Jivatma, is actually the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the sheath of wisdom. They see the Anandamaya Kosha as belonging solely to the Paramatman, the supreme self.
So for them, that ultimate blissful sheath is beyond the reach of individual experience. We can't ever truly access it.
It's not that we can't experience any of it, but rather that our experience is always a reflection, a taste of that divine bliss. They believe that while the individual soul can catch glimpses of this infinite Ananda, the full, unmediated experience is reserved for the Supreme Self.
So it's like there's a hierarchy of bliss. The Anandamaya Kosha represents this ultimate source, this wellspring of pure Ananda, and all other experiences of joy or happiness we have are just trickles flowing from it.
Exactly. And this highlights the incredible diversity within Hindu philosophy itself. While there are definitely common threads, shared concepts that tie everything together, there's also this openness to different interpretations, different ways of understanding these profound truths.
I love that. It's not about finding the one right answer. It's about appreciating the nuances, the different lenses through which we can view these concepts. Kind of like how we've been looking at the Anandamaya Kosha through the lens of modern science, ancient texts, different schools of thought. It all adds to a richer understanding.
I couldn't agree more. Even for me, diving deep into the source material you provided and then having this conversation, it's opened up new ways of thinking about the Anandamaya Kosha.
Me too. It's got me reflecting on where I experience these little sparks of Ananda in my own life, and how understanding this concept might help me connect more deeply to that source. It feels like we've gone way beyond just a theoretical discussion here.
That's the real invitation here, isn't it? Source material, the different interpretations, they provide an intellectual framework, but the real journey begins when we take these ideas and see how they resonate within our own experience.
So to bring it all home for our listeners, the bliss sheath, this Anandamaya Kosha, it's not just some abstract philosophical concept. It's pointing to a very real potential within each of us, a gateway to a deeper, more fulfilling way of living and experiencing the world.
Beautifully said. And it reminds us that even in the most overlooked, seemingly insignificant parts of ourselves, like our own tailbone, there can be hidden depths just waiting to be discovered.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating and complex topic.
The pleasure was all mine. And for you listening, we'd like to leave you with this. What resonated most deeply with you during our exploration of the Anandamaya Kosha? Where do you glimpse this bliss in your own life? And how might a deeper understanding of this concept shift your perspective, even in small ways? Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of this universe, both within and all around us.